there's another thing that I need to say, and for whatever reason this week, it feels like posting videos requires less spoons than writing a blog post or something similar. And now that I think about it, it's probably because I literally type messages all day long for my job, so having to type things out just feels like it uses a lot of cognitive energy and I'm just out. But saying something still feels like a thing that I can do, because I think if I type something, then I can't help myself but edit it. Just, English degree. Anyway, and all of that. So, here's another video. It's okay. I'm just, I have a YouTube channel now, so I'm just a YouTuber in the apocalypse. It's fine. Okay, so before the job that I have now, I was working for the domestic violence hotline. And so I'm really familiar with the dynamics of abuse. And while that was domestic violence, from one individual person to another individual person in an intimate relationship, systems can also be abusive. So systemic racism is abuse. And whether abuse is happening on an individual level or a societal level, the dynamics of power and control are the same. And that is something that has been clear to me, and is just continually clear to me the more I'm listening to what people are saying and paying attention to what's happening. But I think that a lot of people aren't used to thinking about it that way and aren't used to thinking about power dynamics, and that's something that I talked about during the longer video that I recorded the other day. And I meant to include this piece in that video, but I had already been talking for an hour and I kind of forgot. So here it is now. Because there's a dynamic that I'm so familiar with as a domestic violence advocate that I now see playing out like on a societal scale regarding Black people. So I just want to create this parallel in the hopes that it'll make sense to people who are making the kind of arguments that I see them making. So when someone is in an abusive situation, I would say the vast majority of the time, it's hard for people who are outside of the relationship to believe the victim, because people who are abusive, by and large, are very manipulative and charismatic. And so there's this thing that'll happen time and again where the victim tries to, or the survivor, tries to talk about the abuse that they're experiencing to get help or support, and nobody believes them, because the people that they're talking to, friends or family members or community members, will have interacted with the abuser, who was, nothing but kind and sweet and wonderful to them. And so these people are faced with this cognitive dissonance where they think, but I know this person and what you're describing doesn't make sense, and that's not how they are at all. And so they discount what the survivor of abuse is saying because it doesn't fit in with their experiences. But that is a part of the dynamics of abuse and a part of how an abusive person maintains control, and it proves that it proves the intentionality of the abuse. Because if someone, because I think, abusive people will try to blame anything but themselves, for their actions. And, so people will try to blame mental illness or childhood trauma or substance abuse or anger issues or any number of things for the abuse. But if that were true, then this person would be that way with everybody all the time. They wouldn't be able to hold a job, they wouldn't have friends, they would be estranged from their family, right? But this person is so manipulative and so charismatic and so beloved by everyone, and then they use that to avoid taking any accountability for their actions. And what we talk about in domestic violence is that abuse comes from an unhealthy worldview and unhealthy ideas about relationships, and people feel that they deserve or are entitled to power and control, which is just not true. And the law enforcement system is inherently abusive, and the percentage of police officers who are also domestic abusers is significant. And, based on everything that I've heard from the protesters that are dealing with the police now and the people who've been victims of police brutality for decades, everything that's happening is right in line with the dynamics of abuse, and I hear white people saying like, well, but the protester shouldn't be getting violent, or, well, but, can't we all just be loving? And, oh, but surely there are other ways to, peaceful ways to, express your point of view. And, number one, Black people have been doing that, the whole time, and it hasn't worked. And number two, 9 times out of 10, the protesters are peaceful and they aren't doing anything, and it's the police who are inciting the violence against them and then twisting the narrative and controlling the narrative. And so I feel like going to this, participating in this city council meeting, and I had heard bits and pieces of things from what had been shared in news articles and what people who had participated in protests had been sharing on their own social media, which then went viral. But that was only, come to find out, a very small percentage of what's actually happening. And I think, again, we're in this situation where the people who have been the victims of abuse are speaking out about their experiences, and then, other people who haven't had those experiences are saying, well, that can't be true, right? Like when I've interacted with the police, they've done this or that. And so it's, it's the people who are not going to the protests who are deciding what an acceptable way to protest is, but they don't even understand what's happening, because the information that's getting spread majority of the time, again, you have to look at, where is this information coming from? Like, who is reporting this? And not all journalists, provide accurate information. And so if, what the police department is saying about what they did is not, if that's not lining up with what activists are saying, you have to look at the fact that on a societal level, the police have power and authority, and, of course they're not going to admit to what they're doing, because if they did, right, then things would have to change. And they don't want things to change, so they're going to find a way to blame it on the protesters and say that the protesters were inciting things. And I think now, thanks to smartphones, it's easier for people to have the possibility to record videos and share videos, so that people can see with their own eyes what's happening. But what I know from all the work that I've done with survivors is just how important it is to believe people. And I don't know, I feel like, the dynamics of abuse is one of those things where, like, once you can see it, you'll never not see it, but it does take work and time to really be able to pick up on it. But, all of the tactics are the same. And, one of the things that I think helped me as an advocate was to just really pay attention to, like, how the argument's being framed, because survivors, are gonna be highly emotional. They're gonna be possibly blaming themselves or questioning themselves and their experiences, or, wondering if they could have done something differently. Whereas abusive people are going to be never taking accountability and kind of shifting the ground of, like, what the conversation is even about. And, abusive people are going to be spending a lot of time talking about what the other people were doing and never what they were doing, And so, like, that's where, like, the police are going to say, well, but they were being violent and they were throwing water bottles, and they were doing this and they were doing that. And it's like, okay, but what were you doing? Right? And so anytime, somebody's talking a lot about what other people are doing and not about what they're doing, that is a red flag for me, that something else is going on. Because survivors, anything just due to the nature of traumatic experiences, and, like, your memories kind of get all jumbled up. And so, survivors are often confused or upset or questioning themselves, or, just trying to figure out what happened and, like, what went wrong. And, then I think because sometimes, maybe that means you contradict yourself, or you thought you remembered something, but then, now the memory's fuzzy. So, or, like, just these bits and pieces and fragments are, like, coming up. And so it can feel inconsistent. And then I think that makes people think that they're lying. Whereas, the abusive person, like, they have crafted this, like, perfect narrative that, can feel more reassuring for people. But the more that you understand about how traumatic events work, like, it becomes very easy to tell, like, who has been traumatized just by the way that they are responding. And listening to the protesters who have been brutalized by the police in Austin, they were traumatized. Like, if you don't just want to believe it, when you see it, on social media, maybe you'll believe me, like, as a mental health professional and victim advocate, or maybe you could go listen to their stories yourselves. And I think there's also this thing that happens, and I would see it a lot, like, when survivors have been in an abusive relationship for a really long time, and it's just been getting worse and worse. And, because, generally, and like not always, right? Like sometimes things just start off physically abusive, but in a significant portion of the time, abuse starts with emotional abuse and then kind of builds from there. Because once you've psychologically controlled someone, it's so much easier to then start, taking away more tangible forms of agency. So there'll be people that they've, been in this abusive situation for so long, and they've tried so many things because the abusive person is blaming them and gaslighting them and saying, and victim blaming them and saying, like, if you wouldn't have done this, or if you wouldn't have said that, or if you would just do this thing, then none of this would have happened. And so they try. They're like, okay, well, if you want me to do this thing, then I'll do that thing. But then the rules of the game are always shifting, and no matter what they do, it doesn't matter. Like, the abuse keeps happening because it's never been about what the victim was doing. It's always been about the abuser just wanting to have control of the situation. And so, sometimes it takes a long time, and they've tried everything, and no matter what they do, nothing, and it's just getting worse. And then that sometimes is the point at which people reach out for help because they're just so lost and desperate, and they just don't know what to do anymore. And then sometimes what happens, like, when a person gets to that place, because abuse is traumatic, right? And so, like, just trauma after trauma after trauma is layering on, and there's no escape. And no matter what this person does, they're being punished and abused. And so at some point, they just snap and retaliate to defend themselves, and then the abusive person uses that as, like, more evidence for, like, see, like, you're just as bad, or, well, you hit me, and just uses that as, like, another layer of victim blaming. And so, what we would always say is that, like, of course, we don't condone violence, but it's also, there's a difference between an action which is a traumatic response to abuse versus the abuse itself. And so what I see when I look at these protests is this history for Black Americans where for hundreds of years, like for generations, they've been systematically abused and brutalized by American culture. And so like, I think 90% of protesters are not being violent, number one, right? But if a protester, were violent, were to do something violent to a police officer, right, it's the same as that survivor of abuse that just finally, just completely breaks down from all of the trauma. And then it's like it's that fight or flight mode again, where it's just like, it's like if you back an animal, into a corner, it might bite you. But you have to look at, like, what you were doing. It's like at a certain point, humans are mammals. And so when you're faced with this threat to your life, I think at a certain level, just this instinctual response kicks in, but it's self-defense, and I think that's what people don't understand is, like, at that level, like, when you've been so traumatized and so brutalized and so in fear for your life for so long, there's only so much stress and trauma that the human nervous system can withstand before somebody, just completely dissociates and has a nervous breakdown. And I feel like so many minority individuals have been pushed to that point, you know, of just like having a complete breakdown, but then that gets turned against them as, you know, well, why it was their fault. But, you know, it's like you can't just look at that one moment, right? And like that's the other thing that we talk about with domestic violence, but again, I think that extends to this form of abuse as well, that abuse is not ever just one moment. It's a pattern of behavior over time. And so I think people are looking at the end result of something, but they're not seeing everything that came before it. And so I'm going to be paraphrasing, but I saw this meme where it was basically saying, like, you know, some people are surprised at the protests that are getting violent, but like, you know, this person is saying, I'm surprised at how long it took to get to that point, right? Like, I'm actually surprised at the restraint, you know, that people have shown. And, you know, I think it just like what some people have a hard time conceptualizing is that, you know, when there's this pattern of abuse and gaslighting and intimidation and control, and every second you are afraid for your life, like literally every second, and you can't ever escape it, like that's what Black people are experiencing. And, you know, when someone literally, you know, in the case, that we're seeing right now, when someone literally has, you know, their knee on your neck, like, and is killing you, you know, it's like at a certain point, right, like, someone's gonna try to defend themselves. And so that's all Black people are doing. It's self-defense, for all of the violence and trauma and brutality that they've experienced. And so many people are focusing on what are the protesters doing, but I don't see people talking about like what are the police doing or what is the government doing, or looking at the fact that this has been happening for hundreds of years. And, you know, I just think for white people, like, if you could just understand that anything that you can think of that you think that people should be doing, they've done it, and they've tried it, and it didn't work, and it didn't help, and it didn't change anything. And, you know, that's very true from the work that I've done with survivors as well, where it's like, the fact that someone has survived to this point means that they are so strong and so creative and so resourceful and resilient that, you know, truly there is nothing that they have not thought of or tried already, that you could think of for them to do. And anything that you think, well, what if they just did this? Like, I promise you that they have tried that and it didn't help and it didn't change anything. And I just hope that people can hear that, you know, and hear that these are human beings who have been so traumatized over and over. And, you know, in the case that anyone does get violent, it's because they're so in fear for their life and so just completely overwhelmed that they've snapped. And what we need to be asking is, how is it that we created a system that has, you know, created these officers who have pushed people to that breaking point when these are the people that are supposed to be protecting them instead. So I hope that that makes sense. And I just wish that people would stop looking for what they think the protesters are doing wrong and look at what the police are doing wrong, because I promise you that whatever violence, may or may not be happening at these rallies, and like completely aside from, I think there are some organizations where they're sending people to specifically incite violence to cause the police to react in a certain way, which is a whole other thing. But aside from those groups, if there are protesters who stop being peaceful and resort to violence, that is a response to the level of violence that they have received to that point. And so if you are truly concerned about violence and not wanting violence to exist, then the violence that you need to be worried about is the violence that started everything, which is slavery, which has been perpetuated through our legal system and our law enforcement system in ways that might be less visible to some people now, but it's all connected. And the fact that people have been able to withstand the amount of trauma and abuse that they have is frankly astonishing to me to begin with. And as someone who understands trauma and who understands the dynamics of abuse, it makes perfect sense to me that that would happen. And that doesn't mean, and to say I completely understand why this is happening is not necessarily to condone violence, but just to say that if you treat someone with violence, that at some point, them responding back with violence doesn't mean that they deserved everything that you're doing, because no one could ever deserve what is happening right now. And so we have to look at who created this situation and who is perpetuating this situation, and not the response to it. So I hope that makes sense.